Well, Dr. Veith, welcome back to Canada. It's truly a pleasure to have this opportunity to explore some of these topics and themes and to have a prolonged discussion with you. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Okay. I wanted to explore in this discussion some rather controversial and to some perhaps upsetting topics, but believe that we're better to shed some light on them than to dust them under the carpet. And I know I'm mixing metaphors, but the key point is that there's a lot that we need to focus God's light on and we need to explore. So I would suggest we fasten our seatbelts because the overall theme of this discussion tonight, I think, should be focusing on the hypocrisy and apostasy and the intellectual dishonesty that we experience within the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And I'm reminded of a quote by George Orwell, who said that in a world of universal deceit, speaking the truth is a revolutionary act. And I wonder if you could comment on that, thinking of the Adventist Church supplanting the word world.
Well, truth is often sacrificed on the altar of expediency, isn't it? And sometimes our relationships become more important than the truth, and we might lose our focus. It could happen. I believe that we as a church are in a tumultuous state. But then, of course, there was a war, and the war started in heaven, and that war is still raging, and we are told in Revelation that the focus of the war will be within this church. So if we don't see the war within the church, there must be something wrong with the church.
But it's not intuitively obvious at first inspection because the conventional wisdom is to view the church as a sanctuary. In fact, the word sanctuary is used where the services are held in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And sanctuary means to most people a place of protection and security, a haven away from conflict and controversy. And yet that's not what we experience in the church.
Well, Jesus said he didn't come to bring peace, but a sword. And decisions will have to be made. I almost feel like our church has become like a boat where everybody builds a gangplank to set up his pet theology or theory, and someone else sees that the boat is leaning over to one side, sets up a gangplank to the other side to balance it, and eventually everybody's got gangplanks and nobody's in the boat.
A good analogy. A good analogy. Well, maybe before we pursue those thoughts further, I want to establish some fundamentals. And the first one relates to the perception that and the understanding and the belief by Adventists that the Seventh-day Adventist Church is the true end-time remnant church.
Yes.
Could you explore and expand on that assertion to get us started, please?
Well, I've just done a series on the church. Probably the hardest series I've ever done in my life. And it is not intended to be divisive, but to be conciliatory, to bring people back to brother and sister relationships, which will be a tough thing to do because, as you have mentioned, there's so much distrust, there's so much alienation. There have been probably floods of tears in some of the conflicts that we see. But I think God is calling a people back. And this church, prophetically, is the final church. This church, typologically, is the final church. So that's a very important aspect to me. And if we take the story of the children of Israel, where there was always a gathering and a scattering, so we have the same in the Adventist church. And the parallels between what happened to the children of Israel and what happened to the Advent movement are just mind-boggling. They're astounding. And so this is the church. And many people have told me, because of what they see in the church, they want to leave the church. My advice to them is super glue and a big pot and paste it onto the posterior and find yourself a pew and fasten the seatbelt and carry on.
We're going to explore that thought a little later on in our discussion, but I'm glad you've introduced the thought now. We'll let that germinate a bit. But let me make this observation. I can't think of a single faith or denomination or church or belief system in the world that does not proclaim that theirs is the way and the only way. So how is it you can maintain that the Seventh-day Adventist truly is the way and is distinct from all the other believers in all these other systems?
Here are they that keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus. Of all the denominations on this entire planet, this church is the only one that still preaches the precepts of the Reformation. The entire world has turned to futurism. This one still teaches historic continuous prophecy. That's what the Reformers taught. So basically, this is the only Reformed church left. And that's hard for people to swallow.
I think we need to explore what is meant by the word church. To many, church means the concrete and steel and the furnishings, the dwelling within which you come to worship and fellowship. Yes. To others, the church has a broader definition, and in essence it means this collection of true believers and followers and lovers of Christ.
Yes.
So if we accept that latter definition, which I think is supported by the Bible, and if we accept that in the Adventist principles, that it's not just Seventh-day Adventists that will be saved in the second coming.
Nobody is saved by their denominational affiliation.
Okay.
You are saved by your relationship with Christ. Mm-hmm. You are saved by grace, and that not of works, lest any of us should boast. That does, however, not negate obedience. The Holy Spirit, after all, is given to them that obey Him. And if you love me, keep my commandments. That will be a stumbling block. The Sabbath will remain a great cleaver. That's the one issue. And then there are many other issues. We could take any point of doctrine which is inculcated in any denominational system. And I'm not knocking other denominations at all. But I had to make a choice. Which denomination will I belong to? Because God is a God of order. And when He started His church, He put a structural order into the church. People believe, I can follow Christ, and I can follow the promptings of the Holy Spirit. I don't need a church. But the Bible says that God has a body, and He has a choice of bride. And as I said in my series, it's very easy to love Jesus. It's a little bit more difficult to love the bride. But that is the family wherein we have to learn this concept of brotherly love in spite of the different characters that we find in the church. So God has an organized body. God ordered His body in the beginning. God will have an organized structure in the end. Whether the organized structure in itself goes right through to the end, that's not the issue of debate. But God has a people, and He's not leading out one here and one there. He's bringing them into His bride. And the verse says, and the Spirit and the bride say, come. Not just the Spirit. In the case of Paul, when he was still Saul, He sent him to the church in order to receive instruction. He didn't choose him to go and do his own thing. And people today, they would like to serve a bodiless head, or a headless body. And both of them are wrong. You have to take the package deal.
But it brings us back to the fundamental first question, though. How can you truly know it's a Seventh-day Adventist church that is that body and that group that we should be part of, particularly in the face of some of the characters within the church that are such impediments to our spiritual walk?
We need those characters in the church, because otherwise we don't fulfill the prophetic nor the typological scenario. If you take the early Exodus movement, they had their Korahs, they had their Abirams, they had their flamboyant characters, they had their Aarons, they had their Caiaphases. And I was saying in my series, if I now had to judge which one was the perfect character to run the church, I'd go for Caiaphas. He kept the law. He was concerned about his church. He did everything right. He probably was a perfect health reformer, didn't touch anything unclean. I mean, he was straight as a die looking at him from the outside. And if I take Aaron, he was a total disaster. He brought in playing in the fields, probably brought in a couple of bands and a little bit of rock music, and made a golden calf and had everybody dance around it. And I would say this man's a total disaster. He's an apostate, and relegate him to eternal damnation. And I'd be dead wrong. But I'd be judging by my human standard and not by God's standard. Of course, there was repentance and change of heart. We mustn't leave that out.
Mm-hmm. Most surely, as the Bible teaches, it's not our role and job to do the judging. That's God.
No, it's
and,
not our
and
job.
That's blasphemy. But we know what the standards of behavior are. Obedience to the commandments, love of Christ and brothers and sisters.
And we know that human nature rebels against it constantly.
Rebels against it. But when you affiliate yourself with an organized body like the Seventh-day Adventist Church,
yes.
And in the process of doing that, as you progress in your spiritual walk, you experience leaders, conference presidents, executives, pastors, elders, deacons, who, not by your judgment, but by your observation, are dishonest, Sabbath breakers, lecherous, breaking many commandments, teaching falsehoods. In the face of that apostasy and hypocrisy, how can you stay committed to that organization if the leaders themselves, who are supposed to be the spiritual guides, are such fallen creatures?
Well, when Korah rebelled and everybody was turned back to the wilderness, Moses had to go along with them. He wasn't separated as something better, as a reform movement that could finish the job. He identified with these people. Daniel said, "We have sinned." They were a brotherhood in spite of their differences. Jeremiah wrote the Lamentations. He didn't leave the church. Now, I would certainly leave the church if I didn't know this was the prophetic movement. Even if it wasn't for the great lines of prophecy which tell me that this is it, and this is what's going through to the kingdom. And I didn't know that Laodicea doesn't have a candlestick removed from it and passed on to some other organizations like the other churches, but that there will be a shaking and a spitting out rather than a coming out. Then I would certainly be shaken by what I see in the world and what I see in the churches. But let's face it, if I take this gangplank scenario of mine, the problem is not only on the liberal side. The problem is also on the conservative side. And some people have pet theories which can become very divisive, and they will make it an issue of salvation, that you understand it in exactly the same light as they see it. And some of these issues concern the Godhead. Some of these issues concern the nature of Christ. And who will ever, on this side of the divide, understand the Godhead in its fullness? Who will ever be able to comprehend how that Godhood manifested itself in human flesh and identified with our weaknesses, and yet didn't lose hold of the divinity? These are issues where we can create all kinds of scenarios, and people elevate these things to the point of salvation issues, or salvation by diet. Is there such a thing as salvation by diet? God has given us an excellent lifestyle, and we have divides in the church, those that eat this way and those that eat that way, and never the twain shall meet. And is that what God intended? Wouldn't it be nice if we could lay these issues aside, do what is right, leave the consequences to God? It's not my duty to change my fellow Adventists' behavior or his character. It is my duty to point out what is right and what is sin. But to delve into someone else's character and make it my mission to bring that person into the exact same line of thinking as I might have, I have no such work to do. And we have many in the church who want to do that. So the conservatives are rubbing up the liberals, and the liberals, by their action, are frustrating the conservatives, and nobody's in the boat.
But the issues I'm addressing in my questions go beyond those politics within the church, of the liberals and the conservatives and the planks, so however much I like your analogy. It speaks to the essence of being a Christian and of being an Adventist and being obedient and following God's way. And it seems to me that as a Christian, we have a choice in the church when confronted with such abhorrent behavior by the leaders. And by the way, I do not mean to imply that all the leaders behave in abhorrent ways.
I've met some good ones and I've met some bad ones.
As we all have, I think.
In my definition of good and bad.
But we all fall short of the glory of the Lord.
All of us.
No question. But the core essence of the issue to me is, if the leaders, if there's such a pervasive existence of this abhorrent behavior amongst so many of the leaders, how can you trust and respect them to lead this organization? However much you may believe it's the true end-time remnant church, how can you reconcile that belief or faith with the observation and the experience of this abhorrent behavior?
My faith is built on nothing less than Jesus and his righteousness. I have a captain of the ship, and his name is Jesus Christ. He's the captain of the ship. And the ship is described in the Bible in some detail. And the condition in the ship is described in explicit detail. And if you read the message to the Laodiceans, then we're pathetic. And that's about the nicest word I could say. And pathetic does not pertain always to the other guy in the church, because it says all the virgins were sleeping. Pathetic must pertain to me as well. So we're pathetic. We've been told that. We've been told in the typologies that it is the princes who are often the first to run along with the thing. 250 princes in the great apostasy of the early Israelite movement. It was the leaders that went into the apostasy. Not saying that all the leaders did, of course, but this is what we find. So if I see it, does that compel me now to sever my ties? Or does it put me on my knees? That is the question. And what example do I set for people? Am I kind and gentle and long-suffering? Or am I aggressive and vindictive? And let's face it, we all go through stages in life, don't we? And sometimes we are somewhat more boisterous and tempestuous than we should be. And at other times we might be too reserved and should actually speak louder. So we have to figure this out in our personal relationship with Christ, even in the church. And if I serve under a Pharaoh who is blatantly apostate, then I must try and shine the brighter. Because people look at people, unfortunately. They're looking at the wrong examples. They should look at Jesus. And we have the guidelines. We have the spirit of prophecy. We know what is right. And if people reject the spirit of prophecy, they have a serious problem, but it's their problem.
It reminds me of a quote in George Knight's book that I'd like to read you and ask you to comment on. And that comment you just made is a good segue to that. And he talks about sanctified arrogance.
Yes.
This is a quote from his book, The Apocalyptic Vision and the Neutering of Adventism.
Yes.
And I quote, he says, "When a church becomes politically correct in all its claims, and when it loses a proper amount of sanctified arrogance regarding its mission, it manages to neuter itself, even if it continues to brag about its potency."
That's a pretty profound statement. I quite like that. How does a church neuter itself? It's if it refuses to follow the dictate of God to come out and be separate. There is this habitual urge to integrate with others, to not be different, to not be the odd one out. And our church is no different from any of the others in regard to that issue. The Israelites were constantly mingling with the other nations, incorporating their styles of worship. I mean, and the Adventists are masters at it, running to the other nations and incorporating what they have in there, and then not wanting to be the odd one out, not being the singular, straight-laced extremist that doesn't want to rub shoulders with the others, that think they are a cut above the rest. And that's where the problem lies. But the fact of the matter is, truth cannot be compromised. The Sabbath remains the Sabbath. Our doctrines remain our doctrines. If we take one doctrine alone, besides the Sabbath, the immortality of the soul. I mean, what denomination out there doesn't preach the immortality of the soul? Now, the whole efficacy of the plan of salvation fails right there. Because if there is immortality, then Christ died in vain. Why should he die to give me life if I have it anyway? The whole Christian philosophy falls apart and shatters on that very point. And this is where Adventism cuts across these lines of thinking and totally obliterates them, and they have no argument against it. And so the only other thing that they can do is to swallow us up in their ecumenical setups, to try and tell us that we should be behaving more like sisters than some superior individual out there. And it will never, ever work. It cannot work because we're as far removed as the East is from the West from each other. And they have neutered themselves by trying to be politically correct.
But in the face of that, to dwell on this term a bit more, sanctified arrogance to me is a very eloquent way of describing righteous rebellion against error, against what is not judged to be wrong by the observer, but what is known to be wrong by anyone who compares the behavior against the standards set in the Bible. But so many times, certainly in my personal experience, in my walk with the church and with the leaders and others who I know, the experience has been, as soon as you stand up as the little boy at the parade and say that the emperor is wearing no clothes, however mild or meek you may be in making that proclamation, or aggressive or assertive, you are criticized and attacked for being, back to the original comment, a revolutionary because you're speaking the truth.
Yes.
So it's not for us to sanctify ourselves, but it is our role, I believe, as Adventists and as Christians, to proclaim that the emperor isn't wearing clothes. Would you agree?
I think it is our duty, and if you take the messages of Elijah and the antitypes of the Elijahs, John the Baptist, their message was pretty straight. Mm-hmm. They rebuked kings. They pointed to the law. They pointed to the fact that nobody is saved because of their genetic genealogy. And those are the issues that need to be preached at the end of time as well. But it's interesting to me that the Jesuits, in their thinking, say that the individual does not rise above or may not rise above the society in which he lives, because that is a recipe for conflict. And what happens at the individual level must also apply to the church. The church may not rise above the norms and thinkings of society, or else, or even the society of churches, or else that would be construed as arrogance. Mm-hmm. And that arrogant head must be chopped off. And I think we have leaders in the church, and this is the crux of the matter with some of the leadership. They are so scared of losing the head, of it being chopped off, because of the zeal of members wanting to fulfill the Elijah role. So the structure tries to keep the structure intact at the price of sacrificing the preaching of truth. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's a dangerous concept. But Satan, he's a very busy fellow. He'll take the zealous ones and put them into such a fever pitch and put so many doctrines of salvation in there that in the end it becomes blurred as to what our exact mission is. We as a church need to get back to focus. What is our mission? We must preach Christ and Him crucified, and we must preach Christ the King, who is a lawmaker. If Adam and Eve lost the Garden of Eden because of disobedience, it would be inconsistent for God not to claim obedience for a return to the Garden of Eden. Isn't that logical? Mm-hmm. Those are the key issues that this church stands for. And if those key issues are put aside by the powers that be out there, then we can have nothing to do with it. That's our message. That's what we must preach. So my appeal to all of those who are zealous about all the apostasies, focus on the key issues. Start putting aside the side issues. Mm-hmm. Is everybody eating right? Is everybody believing exactly like me? I'm suspicious of that one. I'm suspicious of that one. And another key point is stop looking so much at the other person in the church. Ask yourself, where am I, and am I right with God?
A very important first principle. I think in German there's a phrase, and I don't remember the German, but when you point your finger at someone else, there are 3 fingers pointing back at you.
That's right.
But as Christians and Adventists, unless we're willing to be intellectually dishonest with ourselves and with others around us, which I don't think is a good attribute of a Christian or an Adventist.
Yes.
On fundamental issues like honesty of pastors that don't teach the word, not because it's of how it's done, but because of what is said. It contradicts the spirit of prophecy, contradicts the Bible.
Yes.
Those types of experiences, it's not about the politics of conservative versus liberal. It's not about how you're parting your hair. It's not about what your diet is, whether you wear jewelry. None of those, quite frankly, in my opinion, irrelevant sidebar issues. The fundamental issues of leaders in the church that lie to the congregation, teach error and untruths, lie to their elders and to the other leaders in the church, those to me are the fundamental flaws and fracture points within the Adventist church. And from my personal experience, it's been an abhorrent experience with pastors and leadership in this conference who have been intellectually dishonest, have been preaching untruths, not based on Bruce's judgment, based on a clear comparison to the Word. And yet in the face of trying to proclaim the emperor wearing no clothes, the reaction is more lies, more deceit, more hypocrisy, more apostasy. And it is a very troubling phenomenon within the Adventist church that I have experienced here in British Columbia. And from what I read and discussions with others, it's not restricted just to the BC conference. Yeah. Would you agree that it's not restricted to the BC conference?
It's become a universal problem. Right. From the very poorest countries, where you would imagine that some of the issues couldn't possibly exist, right up into the first world countries, we have the same problem everywhere. And it's become a question of semantics. We argue the points of the 28 fundamental beliefs, and I have seen in committees groupings around a fundamental belief that they all agree on the fundamental belief that are so diametrically opposed to one another, if you take the evolution-creation debate, because they will just redefine the words and say, for example, a day to them means millions of years, but a day to them means 24 hours. And so let's unify on 6 days quite happily, but dare put in literal 24 hours, then there's no unity. So we have these little issues where we have words and statements which seem to be unifying and yet are anything but unifying. I have no creed except the Bible. I have no beef with the 28 fundamental beliefs as they read, but as I've seen them debated, they make anything of it that they want to, whereas the Bible and the spirit of prophecy, to me, is the ultimate criterion. And so if it says in 6 days, the spirit of prophecy will tell me those are literal 24-hour periods. And if I have the two of them together, I cannot go wrong. If I go to the grammar of the Bible and the word yom and the this and the that, it's also a 24-hour period. So to me, the issue is put beyond doubt by the spirit of prophecy. To someone else, the spirit of prophecy is marginalized, and then you end up without a compass, floating any which way the wind blows. And I think that's the problem in our church. And we have been given a gift in this church, which is supposed to be a compass. It doesn't supersede the Bible, but it certainly makes certain issues fundamentally clear, which would be very hazy without it. And I remember when I became a Seventh Day Adventist, one of the points of doctrine that I acclaimed before I was baptized was that I accept the spirit of prophecy. And if our institutes and our higher institutes of learning would once again look at those issues and bring their staff in harmony with it, because that is what Adventism is all about, 90% of the problems would disappear. And we don't do that. We don't do that. We allow every wind of doctrine for the sake of peace when there is no peace.
Not a good advertisement for the Seventh Day Adventist Church if one of our missions is to bring people to the light.
I've heard that too, yes. But, I've seen both sides of that coin as well. We have zealous people who want to bring certain issues to light. And they will use methods that might be very abrasive. So there is a truth, but there's also a way of presenting it. So I've seen leadership be offended by people doing their own thing, but often more the method of doing it than the content of what they are spreading. So these are issues, I don't know, we're all human and we're going to have this problem probably till the end of time. So there again, there are two sides of a story. But I'm one who believes in truth, and truth should not be compromised. And there's a specific life and death issue. You either accept the mark of the beast in the end, or you don't accept the mark of the beast. And the mark of the beast is not just, a law that is going to be enacted and you fall either on this side or on that side of that law. It involves the entire plan of salvation. It involves your entire allegiance to God. And if we could preach this doctrine aright, and look at ourselves again, and not preach necessarily only the letter of the law, but the substance thereof, then we'd have fewer problems within the church.
But it's been my experience, and others have shared with me it's been their experience as well, that for the common church member who's not academically skilled or intellectually familiar with all the nuances of doctrine and how to apply it in your life, and the fundamentals of being an Adventist and being a Christian, which is trying to be obedient, nurture your relationship with Jesus, love Jesus, be obedient out of that love for Jesus, and try to be Christ-like in your dealings with people around you. Those simple but powerful fundamental truths are still compromised when you deal with these errant individuals within the church, to the point where even the most pious of individuals and non-aggressive, and I'm certainly not describing myself with those words, but even the most pious and non-aggressive of individuals that point out error are jumped on and muffled, and the issues are swept under the rug. So it leads me to this question. How pervasive in the worldwide Adventist church, how pervasive is that problem?
You know what? I found it, as I said, even in third world countries, fourth world countries, I found this issue. What is becoming a matter of grave concern is the issue of absolute control. If we are called as children of God, we are accountable to God. The early disciples, they were called in by the Sanhedrin. They were beaten, and they were told not to do this and not to do that and not to do the other. And they said, we must obey God rather than men. Everybody who is called into this church is a child of God. And if I read my Bible correctly, every single one of them receives a gift from God. And every one of them has to give an account of how he works with his talents, whether they are few or whether they are many. Why is it that we seem to have more and more a spirit where someone assumes the right to dictate how the talents must be used? And that is something that is developing more and more in the church. It is a spirit of popery, if I could say it like that. And that is incredibly divisive because we have been bought with a price. And that is a very dear price. And we cannot be sold into a situation where absolute control is handed over to someone who has also been bought with a price. And the Bible clearly says, it shall not be so unto you. You shall not lord it unto others. So that is a major problem that is sticking out its head. We must start realizing that we are individually accountable to God. That doesn't mean that we should disrespect leadership. But when leadership is in conflict with truth, then I must obey God rather than man.
Most certainly God is the ultimate authority. But the Bible does teach that we should respect the leaders of our governments, the leaders of our church,
Yes.
and should follow the rules as long as they don't conflict with what the Bible teaches us.
That's the ultimate rule.
And it's a simple choice to choose God and the ultimate word and the ultimate authority. But it's not so simple in the face of this, what I would call the eroded credibility that exists with our leaders, because it's eroding rapidly. The floodwaters are flushing down the valley, and the sands and the rocks are tumbling away. It's not so easy to make the choice and stand by the choice of God as the ultimate authority when you have pastors and conference presidents poke their fingers at you in your chest and argue that you should not be speaking out, that these are issues that should be ignored and swept under the rug, because to do otherwise is an affront to our church structure and is disrespecting the leadership of the church.
Well, it's probably happened to me more than to most others. And I have this policy: do what is right and leave the consequences to God. And there are points where you say, all right, do they have a point or don't they have a point? Is that which I am presenting divisive, or is it not divisive? That's something that you have to wrestle with and wrestle with God in order to determine. But when it comes to fundamentals of our faith and the pillars of our faith, they're not negotiable, and they will never be negotiable.
Even if conference presidents tell you they should be.
No matter who gets up and tells you, if the fundamental is at stake, it's not negotiable. You must obey God rather than man. But when it comes to issues that are not absolutely necessary for salvation, then one would be wise to even take into counsel or consideration what the most apostate of them is saying. Because take it from his point of view. Take it from an ultra-ecumenical chairperson of an ecumenical council who happens to be an Adventist. Purely hypothetically now. What is his beef? I have to protect the image of my church as being this strange, odd, singular, aggressive entity. And I will do everything in my power to protect that image. He's going to suppress the preaching of the little horn powers. He's going to suppress the second angel's message with every fiber of his being. And then those who have the instruction to preach it and those that wish to protect the structure are going to be at an impasse. There's just no way around that. And then let it be so. But let's do it wisely, let's do it circumspectly, and let the truth do the cutting rather than we become the instruments of cutting. There will be a shaking in this church. I preached a sermon where I spoke about the various factions in the church, the Daniel faction, and then the Ezekiel faction, and the Jeremiah faction. Those prophets addressed certain areas within the same church. Ezekiel addressed the tremendous apostasy that was taking place in the church, and turning their backs towards the temple and bringing in sun worship and Babylonian worship styles. He addressed all of that. It was in the church. And Jeremiah was speaking with the top structural leadership and telling them, you cannot follow the road that you are following. They ripped his document apart, they threw it in the fire, they put him into the dungeon, they put him into the stocks. I mean, they didn't treat him too well. But the end result is what we have to look at. Those kings, they were taken captive, they were put to death, their eyes were put out. I mean, it's horrendous when you read the biblical account. And yet, the door of the jail of Jeremiah was opened, and he was set free. So, in the ultimate judgment, God is the one who will take care of all of this. And then I use another example. In that late period of the history of the children of Israel, you had Manasseh. I mean, who could have been worse than him? The blood ran in the streets. You had the prophet Isaiah sawn in half. And Isaiah died thinking, this is the most evil king that ever ruled. He is going straight to perdition. And you have to face him in heaven and say, what are you doing here? Yeah, so who's the Manasseh? Who's the Caiaphas? Who's the Aaron? And we have to weep between the porch and the altar for all the evil that is done in Israel.
But you know, standing up and proclaiming that the emperor has no clothes can be motivated. That action can be motivated by a number of factors. One of them could very well be...
Most emperors don't have clothes. Definitely don't have clothes at the moment.
Unfortunately, though, most people think they see clothing, and that's the problem. But the motivation to proclaim the obvious from the simple observational powers of a child can, in the church context, can be self-glorification, self-righteousness. Look at me, look how important and intellectual and discerning I am.
Yes.
So it could be very selfishly motivated.
Sure.
On the other hand, the factors could be selflessly motivated. Things like, I see my church being torn apart by an errant pastor. I see congregation members leaving this particular church and going to others. I see the heartache and the tears and the denied opportunity for new converts to come and be baptized because of the behavior of a pastor in terms of his dishonesty and violation of commandments. In that circumstance, the sanctified arrogance that Knight talks about is justified. You have to do something to preserve the church, even if it's just to point out the obvious. And yet, even if it's selflessly motivated, none of us are perfect. And however much we try to do it, it'll never be done as perfectly as it could have been done by Jesus.
Absolutely. But now let's go back to the typology. In the time of Elijah, when he was preaching, Jezebel had the Baal priests and the Asherah priests and all those sitting at her table well under her control. And we find Jezebel, of course, in the middle church of the book of Revelation. And where were God's true heralds? They were locked up in caves. they were hidden away, and they were secretly fed. And God seemed to tolerate that situation until it became intolerable. And for 3.5 years, there was no rain. That didn't mean that the dancing of the Baal priests ceased. But it didn't bring any rain. There was just no spiritual food. There was no Holy Spirit. There was nothing. The church was stone dead. It took the slaughter of the priests of Baal, figuratively speaking now, not literally, and the removal of that which was weighing Israel down, and a rediscovery of the simplicity of the worship of the true God, as opposed to the gesticulations that we have out there that restored Israel. And then it went apostate again, didn't it? After that. But that's what we need. We need a house cleaning, but who's going to do the house cleaning? It is God that answered by fire. It is God that licked up the offering. And we'll have to just wait for a terrible, terrible shaking in the church. And the only thing that will cleanse this church is going to be persecution.
So thank you, Dr. Veith. An interesting start to our discussion on these rather thorny topics. We will continue this discussion the next time we meet.
Thank you.